Hello again, and welcome back to the second video in this series of short videos about various aspects of Anglican identity. I'm relieved to think that I didn't put you off too greatly in the first video, in which I tried to say something about the Church of England generally without tying myself up in too many knots. My name is Father Richard Norman. I'm the Vicar of St George's Church in Bickley, just down the road from St Joseph's, and in this video I'm going to talk a little bit about this parish and to describe some of the features of church life here. And again, perhaps to begin with a sort of historical overview a little bit. And this parish came into existence in the 19th century, at which point there was only one parish of Bromley. Just a single parish of Bromley. There are now 14 Anglican parishes covering that same area. But of course it was an era in which there was great expansion going on around London. People were moving out towards the suburbs, and one of the reasons that they could move out into the suburbs was the extension of the railway network, which made travelling into town that much easier, and is also the reason why St George's Church was built, because the man who built it, a man named George Wythes, who lived in Bickley Manor, in the estate which covered this area of Bromley. George Wythes made the equivalent of millions of pounds as an entrepreneur in the railways, as an industrialist. So he made his fortune on the railways, and as would happen in times past, the way that one demonstrated the size of one's wealth was to put up civic amenities, including churches. And so George Wythes commissioned a church to be built here in Bickley. If you've come past St George's, or if you know the church I'm talking about, or you've seen it, you'll know that it's an enormous building. It's almost sort of cathedral-esque in its proportions. And I don't think there was any requirement for a church of that size at that time. It was simply to show off the fact that George Wythes had all this money, that he decided to build such an impressive and large church. And the church was consecrated for public worship in 1864, so just over 160 years ago. At one point in its history, it had a daughter church called St Michael's Widmore that was in Nightingale Lane, just around the corner from St George's Primary School. That church closed for worship in the 1950s, I think it was the 1950s, and is now the headquarters of the 15th Bromley Scout Group, who interestingly have a St George's cross on the back of their scout scarves to show the historical connection between the two places. So 1864 the church opens, and it's had quite an eventful history since then, which can be seen in the fabric of the building. Talked about the railways being so important for the growth of the population and then the financing of the building of the church itself. Well, those railway lines running from London down to the south coast also meant that St George's, or at least the area of Bickley, was quite a target for bombs being dropped in the Second World War, because the Nazis were attempting to disrupt the supply lines, moving troops and materials down to the coast, and so they would aim for these railway lines. In fact, they didn't want to destroy the church, because having such a tall spire made it a useful landmark by which to navigate, and so the church itself was spared from being destroyed, but a bomb did fall very, very close to it. It fell onto the vicarage, which is our word for the presbytery, essentially. So I'm sitting in my house, which is a much later build. There was a house built for the incumbent in the beginning when the church was put up, but that was completely flattened by a bomb, and this house was put up in the 60s. And although it didn't destroy the church building, it took all of the glass out of the windows. It shattered all of the stained glass that was in the windows, and so we only have one pane of stained glass which dates from the original foundation of the church, and it's actually one of the least interesting bits of stained glass. But if you're walking around the building outside, you'll see a curious feature, which is that along the nave, where there are windows cut into the wall, from the outside it looks as if there should be 3 windows in each set of windows, but when you go inside there's only 1, and that's because there were 3 windows originally, but when it came to replacing them after the Second World War, there was only sufficient compensation money to make a smaller number of stained glass windows to the requisite sort of quality of craftsmanship and workmanship, and so those windows, the other windows, were simply bricked in, blocked up and plastered over. You can see the evidence of it from the outside, but not from the inside. So that's what happened in the Second World War, and then, as if that wasn't enough, in 1989 there was a huge fire in the church. Fortunately, not believed to have been started deliberately. It's not really clear what the cause of it was, but perhaps faulty wiring in a new organ that had been installed. And of course, churches are fairly combustible if you think about the amount of wooden seating and furniture and things that they contain. And so the church was very badly damaged during this fire in 1989 and had to be completely reordered inside after that point. It was done so to a very high specification, actually, although one doesn't ever wish a fire in your church. The fact that so many of the fixtures and fittings date from relatively recently means that it's a church in very good repair. And the reordering took place a few years afterwards, and means that the interior is very surprising when you come into it. Having seen an outside that's Victorian Gothic, you then come inside and you see something much more modern, and which was organised in line with the liturgical and theological principles by which the church lived at that time and still does. So the fire in 1989, and there have been bits and pieces that have happened to the church since then, but I do encourage you to come in and have a look at the building itself. We are unusual in being unlocked during the daytime each day, and visitors can come in whenever they wish, and you can get a proper look at the place that I'm describing and see if you can identify some of those features that I've mentioned so far. A little bit more than about the parish. So I spoke in the first video about the way in which the Church of England exercises a ministry to the whole community. And so when we measure the size of our parishes, at least the sort of population size of our parishes, we don't talk about just the people who come to Mass or who are on our electoral roll, our sort of membership role for the church. We talk about everyone who lives in an area. And so the parish of Bickley has a population of 8,500. Now, sadly, there are not 8,500 people at Mass here every Sunday, but 8,500 people for whom this is, in legal terms, their parish church, and that does come with certain rights. They can have their ashes interred here in the churchyard, they can be married in the church, they have what's called a qualifying connection in order to access those particular ministries. So a population of about 8,500, and also I spoke in the previous video about how there's a great deal of sort of liturgical variety in the Church of England. Churches can look very different in terms of the services and the worship that they offer. And St George's stands in what's called the Anglo-Catholic tradition of the Church of England. So if you wanted to oversimplify, there are sort of three strands within the Church of England. There is an Anglo-Catholic tradition that, as I said previously, would be very familiar to you if you were to come in. I'll say why just in a second. There is a sort of mainstream, sometimes that's called the broad church in the middle, and then there is a more evangelical, charismatic side to the Church of England as well. But St George's is in the Anglo-Catholic tradition of the Church of England, and our worship reflects that. So if you come to a Sunday Mass, you will see Eucharistic vestments, there'll be incense. We in fact use the Roman Missal, the same liturgical book as you would do, and the priests are called Father, and we have a devotional life that incorporates Catholic spirituality as well. There's a daily Mass, there is the Rosary each weekend, there's Holy Hour and Eucharistic Adoration, confessions are heard and offered. I'm recording this video for you on Mothering Sunday, the fourth Sunday in Lent, and during Lent there are Stations of the Cross. There'll be the full liturgies of Holy Week when we come to them as well. So it'll be very, very familiar, I think, to you. Perhaps the only difference would be that it actually would be slightly more old-fashioned. Many Roman Catholic parishes today have quite a modern character and feel to their liturgy, whereas we've retained some of the more traditional elements of the liturgy here at St George's. So there's plain chant, there's Latin, some of the vesture of the clergy is more traditional, all sorts of bits and pieces like that show the tradition in which we stand. About as many people in this country attend Roman Catholic Masses each Sunday as attend Church of England services, but the distribution of worshippers is very different, and that's because the Church of England has so many more parishes and so many more churches. So nationally, or at least in England, there are 12,500 Anglican Church of England parishes served by about 16,000 clergy, and that's in contrast to just over 3,000 Roman Catholic parishes. So you can see that if you have the same number of people attending in each denomination, but there are only 3,000 Anglican parishes and 4 times as many Anglican parishes, then we're going to have far fewer people in each church. And in fact, according to the official statistics, the average Church of England congregation will be about 40 to 50 people. Now, some of that is because we have a lot of very, very small churches in the countryside with perhaps 10 or 20 people on a Sunday. Then in towns and cities there are sort of much larger congregations. At St George's, before the pandemic, we would have around 100 people on a Sunday, which makes us a larger sort of Anglican church by those definitions. But obviously those sorts of numbers would be very small for Catholic parishes, if that's your total mass attendance on a Sunday. And we have been able to stay open during the pandemic, apart from during the first and second lockdowns. And as I say, yesterday, Mothering Sunday, a few more people coming to Mass than perhaps would otherwise do. And so we're about 95 people today at Mass. So it was very encouraging to see the recovery that was taking place, about 95% of pre-pandemic levels. I'm reaching my time limit again. This is the trouble with me, is that if you allow me to talk, I'll just go on and on and on. The only other bits I wanted to say were that because we have that ministry to the whole community, there can be times in the year when our congregations fluctuate massively. So at Christmas time, because Christmas still has such a cultural cachet, whereas on a normal Sunday we might have perhaps 100 people at Mass, at Christmas time, between Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, and if you include a carol service as well, there are years when we'll have 800 people coming along, because there are those people who feel that affinity to the church but are not necessarily very regular in their practice. And the final thing to say, as I said earlier during this video, is that St George's Church remains open to visitors throughout the day. So if you're out on your daily exercise or taking a walk down in this direction, do put your head around the door and come in and see the church and explore a little bit of that history and that physical presence. And if you would like to, tune in for the third video in this series, and I'll look forward to talking to you then. Thank you.